Okay, everybody, welcome to this discussion on solving the General Patton mystery. Continuing on our discussion of what went on with Germany before, during, and after World War II and all other events related thereto. General George Patton's murder on December 21st, 1945 is one of the most concealed events in military history. Although Patton's military file at the National Archives in St. Louis has over 1,300 pages of documents, only a handful of pages are devoted to his fatal car crash. It clearly was a murder. Strangely, the 5 on-the-scene military reports of the incident disappeared shortly after being archived. Why do you suppose that was? Was this really an accident, or was it planned, as we have seen so many times in similar situations over the years? And if it was planned, why? Well, let's have a look. Patton's demise actually began on December 9th, 1945, when, after setting out on a pheasant hunting trip near Mannheim, Germany, a 2-ton U.S. Army truck had collided into his Cadillac staff car. Patton suffered neck injuries, but was not seriously hurt. Yet his driver, Horace Woodring, and his chief of staff, General Hap Gay, walked away with barely a scratch. On the way to the hospital, Patton's rescue vehicle was struck again by another 2-ton Army truck. Did you know this? This time he was injured more severely, but still clung to life. Are you going to tell me that this was a coincidence? Interestingly, Patton was the only one injured at the time. The others didn't even have so much as a scratch once again. Anyway, neither of the truck drivers were arrested, nor had their names been disclosed, although Patton's driver had stated that the first truck was waiting for them on the side of the road as they had started up from a railroad track stop. Isn't that interesting? It was later reported by former intelligence agent Ladislas Farrago that the driver of the first truck, Robert Thompson, who was whisked away to London before he could ever be questioned conveniently, was not authorized to drive the vehicle and had 2 mysterious passengers with him in violation of current rules, right? Fargo also pointed out that although the crash had occurred on a remote road on a quiet, no-work Sunday morning, a large crowd of mostly military personnel had quickly descended on the scene. Once at the hospital, Patton was able to contact his wife in America, urging her to remove him from the hospital because, quote, "they're going to kill me here," he said. And that is exactly what they did. On December 21st, 1945, Patton was pronounced dead due to an embolism, that is, a bubble of blood, which is fatal when it reaches a vital organ, right? Is that really what happened? The truth is, it can be introduced into the bloodstream with a syringe by anyone with brief medical training, right? So there you go. The accidents didn't succeed, so they had to fall back on plan B. We'll use our corrupt medical establishment, which has always been corrupt, hasn't it? There's always been one or two in every hospital, at least, that they could call on. Oh, there's more than one or two now, isn't there? COVID proved that. But even back then, there was always one or two at the highest level that they could call on who would know of some minion that would just follow orders. And yeah. Interestingly, this was given as the cause of Warren Harding's death as well, whose body was never subjected to an autopsy. I'll talk about him sometime, but he definitely was murdered as well, as was Zachary Taylor, as it turns out, who just so happened to be opposed to central banking and to removal of tariffs. So there's two more presidents that we can add to the list of assassinations of American presidents that have never made it on the list for obvious reasons. Anyway, not only did the U.S. Army not conduct an investigation into Patton's accident, but no questions were raised about his so-called embolism either, right? Well, apparently it was an embolism, but as to how that actually had come about. Also, the remains of this American hero were never brought to the United States. Did you know that? We see so many familiar patterns here, don't we? Obvious, massive cover-up. Clearly, he was murdered. But who exactly wanted him dead? When Patton assumed command of occupied Germany in October of 1945, he came to a new understanding of the European conflagration. The war hero expressed grave misgivings regarding the harsh treatment of Germans by the Allies and urged creating a strong Germany to counter the advance of Soviet Russia into Eastern Europe. Well, guess who didn't want that to happen? And guess who was not impressed with Mr. Patton having a conscience and being disgusted with the way Germany was treated? Can you fill in that blank? The more that Patton saw of the Soviets, the stronger his conviction grew that the right course of action was to stifle, their opportunity to continue to, to exist as a world threat, right? He wanted to, cut them off at the pass, right? And if that was done, guess who would have not been happy? They planned the whole Cold War strategy, as I said, at the Bretton Woods Conference. I'll talk about that in detail down the line. But, over a year before the war came to a conclusion, they were already planning how the U.S. was going to be the savior of the world from communism, how that lie would be used as a cover for outright imperialism, right? He saw that the Soviets, needed to be taken out, right? That the Allies needed to march on into Russia. They didn't want that. Oh, he was threatening to spoil everything, right? He was going to stop the mistreatment of Germany to help build Germany up and to stop Soviet advances and to dismantle the Soviet communist Jew empire. Oh, no. He was getting under a lot of skin, wasn't he? He was pissing off the elite Jew bastard community. He had to go. Patton was thwarted by Mr. Jewish Roosevelt and his advisors, Henry Morgenthau and Bernard Baruch, particularly, who had pursued a post-war bond with the Jewish Bolshevik Soviets, right? If Patton's advice was adhered to, the elite Zio bankers would not have had the phony excuse that they needed to involve the U.S. in so many phony military incursions during the fake Cold War, right? He would have cut it off at the pass before it ever got off the ground. Just a few years later, of course, the first of many campaigns began in Korea. And then, of course, not long after that, the stage was set for the Vietnam War. And even in between those two wars, you had a lot of scuffles involving not just the military, but the CIA in Guatemala, Iran, on and on and on. At the end of the day, by the close of the phony Cold War, there were over 60 military campaigns of the U.S. in various countries around the world, sometimes, repeat performances, right? Twice here, 3 times there. We'd return to Guatemala. One intervention wasn't enough. We had to go back again, right, to complete the job. But over 60 times this went on during the Cold War. And none of that would have happened. None of it. Most of our national debt came from, or at least up until the end of the Cold War, almost all of the U.S. national debt was accrued from the Cold War, right? From, these military campaigns. We wouldn't have had any of that if Patton, was not removed from the picture. Several months before the end of the war, Patton recognized the fearful danger to the West that was posed by the Soviet Union, and he had disagreed bitterly with the orders which he had been given, to hold back his army and wait for the Red Army to occupy vast stretches of German, Czech, Romanian, Hungarian, and Yugoslav territory, which the Americans could have easily taken instead, right? He saw that these orders were bullcrap, and he voiced his opposition quite loudly. On May 7th, 1945, just before the German capitulation, Patton had a conference in Austria with U.S. Secretary of War Robert Patterson. Patton was gravely concerned over the Soviet failure to respect the demarcation lines separating the Soviet and American occupation zones, right? He was also alarmed by plans in Washington for the immediate partial demobilization of the U.S. Army. Patton had said to Patterson, quote, "Let's keep our boots polished, bayonets sharpened, and present a picture of force and strength to the Red Army. This is the only language that they will understand and respect." Patterson replied, "Oh, George, you have been so close to this thing so long that you have lost sight of the big picture." Ha, ha, ha. What big picture? The Zio Jew bastard big picture. Patton replied, "I understand the situation. Their," meaning the Soviets, "their supply system is inadequate to maintain them in a serious action such as I could put to them. They have chickens in the coop and cattle in the hoof. That's their supply system, he said. They could probably maintain themselves in the type of fighting that I could give them for 5 days. After that, he said, it would make no difference how many million men that they have. And if you wanted Moscow, I could give it to you. They lived on the land coming down. There is insufficient left for them to maintain themselves going back. Let's not give them time to build up their supplies, he said. If we do, then we have had a victory over the Germans and disarmed them, but we have failed in the liberation of Europe. We have lost the war. He was absolutely right, everything he said here, but unfortunately he didn't realize what sellout pieces of crap everybody else was all around him, that he was the only one that had any common sense and a conscience. He found out the hard way when it was too late that he was bucking a system that had no interest in doing the right thing. On May 18th, 1945, Patton wrote the following in his diary. In my opinion, the American army, as it now exists, could beat the Russians with the greatest of ease because while the Russians have good infantry, they are lacking in artillery, air, tanks, and in the knowledge of the use of the combined arms, whereas we excel in all three of these. If it should be necessary to fight the Russians, the sooner we do it, the better. But again, that was not to be the plan. It was already planned long ahead of this time that the Russians are going to be left untouched, right? You need a bad guy so you can justify your imperialistic campaigns. 2 days later, he repeated his concern when he wrote to his wife saying, quote, if we have to fight them, the Russians, now is the time. From now on, we will get weaker and they will get stronger. We have to do it before they get much stronger, he was saying. He, like MacArthur in the Korean War, knew that he was being forced to play the war game by a set of rules designed for failure. And better yet, Patton knew where these sinister rules were coming from. And he also knew that they wanted him dead, as he expressed, right? They're going to kill me. He knew. Unfortunately, when it was too late for him to get out of harm's way, but he did finally see what he was up against. He knew this system was corrupt to high hell. He thought initially that he was dealing with decent, scrupled human beings, right? Boy, did he find out, though, the hard way. Really, really goddamn sad. Of course, he was not the only one from that era, right? I'll talk about some others high up in the military who met a similar horrible fate for opening their mouths. Anyway, the conflict between Jewry and Patton grew even stronger when he refused to remove German civilians from their homes so as to house displaced persons, quote unquote. Most of these were Jews, of course, who were never actually displaced to begin with, but rather had swarmed Germany from Poland and Russia and were part of the Jewish Brigade. Patton's diary entry for September 17th, 1945, had this to say. The virus started by Morgenthau and Bernard Baruch, against the Germans is Semitic revenge. Woo! And he was so right, wasn't he? And what was the revenge for? What did the Germans do that they wanted revenge against them for? They were independently minded and were stiff competition for their economic control. They didn't want that. He went on to say, now I'm being ordered to remove German civilians from their homes for the purpose of housing displaced persons. It appears that this order is to punish the German race and not individual Germans. Absolutely. He recognized this was a war on the German people. It's against my Anglo-Saxon conscience, he said, to remove a person from his house without due process of the law. You see why he had to go? There was only room in a position like that for individuals who had no conscience whatsoever, just like so very many doctors in the COVID era, right? And that still continues on today, doesn't it? He went on to say, those issuing these orders believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not. Yes, indeed. This applies particularly to the Jews who are lost to all decency, relieving themselves on the floors, showing themselves to be lower than animals. Wow. Wow. Well, there you go. You want to know who was behind his demise? There you go, right there. I mean, everything we've talked about up to this point clearly points a finger at you-know-who. But these statements here, wow. Right from his own diary, folks. At a press conference in Regensburg, Germany, on May 8th of 1945, immediately after Germany's surrender, Patton was asked whether he planned to treat captured SS troops differently from other German POWs. His answer was this: no, SS means no more in Germany than being a Democrat in America. That is not to be quoted. I mean by that initially the SS people were special sons of bitches, but the war progressed. They ran out of sons of bitches, and then they put anybody in there. In other words, these people aren't even the original problem. Some of the top SS men, he said, will be treated as criminals, but there is no reason for trying someone who was drafted into this outfit. In other words, a lot of these SS men weren't, tyrants and, wanting to crush out opposition. Sure, that did go on. Of course it did under Hitler. But, by this time later on in the war, they were just grabbing people off the streets, basically, right? Just wanted any fighting person to get their hands on. These were average civilians in, military uniforms, but they weren't the problem. The Jews wanted all the Germans wiped out as much as they could get their hands on, right? He recognized that this was a carte blanche, campaign of war against the German people, and he wanted no part of it. Despite Patton's request that his remark not be quoted, the press eagerly seized on it, the Jew-run press. And the Jews, along with their front men in America, screamed in outrage over his comparison of the SS and the Democratic Party, as well as over his announced intention of treating most SS prisoners humanely, because they had gone to great extents to demonize the Germans, especially, the ones in military uniform, right? With great reluctance, and only after repeated promptings from Eisenhower, he had thrown German families out of their homes to make room for more than 1 million Jewish DPs, or displaced persons, part of the famous 6 million who had supposedly been gassed. But he balked when ordered to begin blowing up German factories in accord with the infamous Morgenthau plan, to completely destroy Germany's economic infrastructure. Once again, he recognized this was absolutely pure saboteurism. In his diary, he wrote this: "I doubted the expediency of blowing up factories because the ends for which the factories are being blown up, that is, preventing Germany from preparing for war, can be equally well attained through the destruction of their machinery, while the buildings can be used to house thousands of homeless persons." Yeah, there was no need to blow up the factories themselves, right? If you're so concerned about them building a war machine, just destroy the machines themselves, but keep the buildings to house people. Oh, no, they didn't want that. They didn't want that. They wanted people displaced so they die from exposure to the elements, if nothing else, right? In a letter to his wife of September 14th, 1945, and you can bet the bastards were intercepting a lot of these, reading them to get an idea where he was at, where he was coming from, right? By the way, I hate to get off on a tangent here, but this just made me think of something. You know, when I was in college, they would have you write position papers on key issues, right? And then you would put them into your portfolios. And you weren't allowed to keep those papers. For 5 years after graduation, the school kept your portfolios in a locked room. And if you were a candidate for being hired as a teacher, someone from the state would come and request to look at your portfolios. They were given a key to the room that had the portfolios locked in the room. Nobody else went in there from the college. Only the state representative went in there. And they would peruse through your writings to see if you could be trusted to get a job. And if not, you wouldn't get hired. This is what was going on, folks. This made me think of this, you know. They would read your papers to get inside your head. That's what was going on here with his diaries and other personal papers. They were intercepting his mail, right? You can bet they heated it up, or you know, put it over a boiling pot so that the moisture would loosen up the glue, and then they could reseal it and no one would even know that it was read, right? They saw stuff he was writing to his wife and they realized, yeah, this man's going to be way too much of a problem. We're not going to be able to bring him around to our way of thinking. And so it was decided to pop him off. Anyways, as I said, in a letter to his wife of September 14th, 1945, he further protested, quote, I am frankly opposed to this war criminal staff and their tactics. It is Semitic, he said. He knew that it was a Jewish enterprise, that this whole thing was being orchestrated by them against the Germans. I am also opposed to sending POWs to work as slaves in foreign lands, i.e. the Soviet Union's gulags, where many will be starved to death. Well, many that weren't sent there starved to death anyway in the camps that Eisenhower oversaw, right? The Jew Eisenhower. But notice he recognized here that this was a Semitic campaign. Despite his disagreement with official policy, Patton followed the rules laid down by Morgenthau and others back in Washington as closely as his conscience would allow. To some degree, he didn't have much of a choice for a time anyway. But he tried to moderate the effect, and this brought him into increasing conflict with Eisenhower and the other politically ambitious generals, right? He was a man of conscience and was sickened by what he saw being done in Germany. He was hoping he could make a difference, and that's what cost him his life. In another letter to his wife, which clearly they had read, he commented, quote, "I have been at Frankfurt for a civil government conference. If what we are doing," to the Germans, "is liberty, then give me death." Anyway, he said, "I can't see how Americans can sink so low. It is Semitic, and I am sure of it." Yeah, he figured it out all right. He figured it out. He further noted in his diary, "Today we received orders in which we were told to give the Jews special accommodations. If for Jews, why not Catholics, Mormons, etc.? We are also turning over to the French several 100,000 prisoners of war to be used as slave labor in France. It is amusing to recall that we fought the revolution in defense of the right of man and the Civil War to abolish slavery, and have now gone back on both principles." Well, unbeknownst to him, that was not the reason for either of those wars. But, nevertheless, that's what he thought anyways, right? He was sincere in that belief. After a visit to ruined Berlin, he wrote his wife on July 21st of 1945, quote, "Berlin gave me the blues. We have destroyed what could have been a good race, and we are about to replace them with Mongolian savages, and all of Europe will be communist." Holy Jesus H, man. He had the whole game plan all figured out, didn't he? "It said," he wrote, "that for the first week after they took it, Berlin, all women who ran were shot, and those who did not were raped. I could have taken it over instead of the Soviets had I been allowed to." Son of a bitch. This conviction that the politicians had used him and the U.S. Army for a criminal purpose continued to grow stronger and stronger up until his death, right? During a dinner with French General Alphonse Juin in August of 1945, Patton was surprised to find the Frenchman in agreement with him. His diary entry for August 18th quoted Juin, the French official, as saying, quote, "It is indeed unfortunate that the English and the Americans have destroyed in Europe the only sound country, and I do not mean France. Therefore, the road is now open for the advent of Russian communism." And who was behind that? It wasn't the Brits or the Americans. It was the Jew bastards who controlled the English and American governments. They're the ones that wanted communism to thrive. And oh, what a nice little game they played, because all the military incursions during the Cold War were fought in the name of containing communism, when in fact they were spreading it, weren't they? Later diary entries and letters to his wife reiterated this same conclusion, right? On August 31st, he wrote, "Actually, the Germans are the only decent people left in Europe. It's a choice between them and the Russians. I prefer the Germans," he said. God friggin' damn it. And then on September 2nd, he further wrote, What we are doing is to destroy the only semi-modern state in Europe so that Russia can swallow the world. As a result of statements like these, the Jewish-owned press in America began a smear campaign describing Patton as being soft on Nazis, right? In another diary entry, speaking about the media attacks being launched against him, he wrote this: "There is a very apparent Semitic influence in the press." Oh, you bet your ass, baby. He was getting it, guys. Oh, was he ever getting it? "They are trying," he said, to do two things. First, implement communism, and second, see that all businessmen of German ancestry and non-Jewish antecedents are thrown out of their jobs. Absolutely. Wow. Wow, did he get it? They have utterly lost the Anglo-Saxon conception of justice and feel that a man can be kicked out because somebody else says he is a Nazi. He recognized that they were using the Nazi trump card for all kinds of chicanery, right? They're still doing it, aren't they? He ended off in this entry by saying, another point which the press harped on, the Jewish press, was the fact that we were doing too much for the Germans to the detriment of the DPs, the displaced persons, most of whom are Jews, he said. I could not give the answer to that one because the answer is that, in my opinion, and that of most non-political officers, it is vitally necessary for us to build Germany up now as a buffer state against Russia. In fact, I am afraid we have waited too long. He knew that Russia was deliberately being propped up, that it was being allowed to continue on, right? In another letter to his wife, he penned these words: "I will probably be in the headlines before you get this, as the press is trying to quote me as being more interested in restoring order in Germany than in catching Nazis. I can't tell them the truth, that unless we restore Germany, we will ensure that communism takes America." Oh, if he were alive today to see where we are at, he personally could have stopped this and would have, right? But instead, they stopped him. But isn't it interesting, though, that all the while the claim was being made that we're going to stop the Nazis? They were smuggling a great deal of Nazis out through the rat lines, through the Operation Paperclip fiasco, right? They wanted the sleazy ones that would do their bidding and share their, intelligence and whatnot with them, right? Their expertise in certain areas. They didn't want to kill all the Nazis, only certain ones that had a conscience, that were decent. What a sick joke, man. But anyway, Eisenhower responded immediately to the press outcry against Patton and made the decision to relieve him of his duties as military governor and kick him upstairs as the commander of the 15th Army, right? Eisenhower was such a friggin' scumbag. People praise him because of his farewell address denouncing the military-industrial complex. And even though that is a good speech and everything he said is true, right? He was a scumbag extraordinaire. He played a very big role in the military-industrial complex, building it up. Just like, Churchill's denunciation of the international Jews as being behind the Bolshevik Revolution and wanting to control the world. Everything he said in that quote is true, but he was one of their biggest whores ever, right? Anyway, in a letter to his wife on September 29th, Patton indicated that he was, in a way, not unhappy with his new assignment because, quote, I would like it much better than being a sort of executioner to the best race in Europe. In other words, he didn't mind being removed from that position because he didn't want to have to violate his conscience, even though he was trying to temper things down in the way the Germans were being treated. He was still, to some degree, for window dressing purposes anyway, he had to somewhat follow orders, and he hated what he was being made to do. So he's glad that he said he was glad he was removed from that position. On October 22nd, he wrote a long letter to Major General James G. Harbord, who was back in the States at the time. And in this letter, Patton bitterly condemned the Morgenthau policy, Eisenhower's disgusting behavior in the face of Jewish demands. Well, he was a Jew himself. Obviously, Patton wasn't aware of that. Also denouncing the strong Soviet bias in the press and the politicization, corruption, degradation, and demoralization of the U.S. Army. Anyway, he saw the demoralization of the Army as a deliberate plan of America's enemies, a deliberate goal. He told General Harbord, quote, I have been just as furious as you at the compilation of lies which the communist and Semitic elements of our government have leveled against me and practically every other commander. Notice how he keeps using that term Semitic. Anyway, in my opinion, it is a deliberate attempt to alienate the soldier vote from the commanders because the communists know that soldiers are not communistic and they fear what 11 million votes of veterans would do. In this same letter, Patton also revealed his own plans to fight those who were destroying the morale and integrity of the Army and endangering America's future by not opposing the growing Soviet threat, right? He stated, quote, it is my present thought that when I finish this job, which will be around the first of the year, I shall resign, not retire, because if I retire, I will still have a gag in my mouth. I should not start a limited counterattack, which would be contrary to my military theories. In other words, I'm not going to hold back. I'm going to unleash everything after I step down. But should wait, he said, until I can start an all-out offensive. Wow. Once again, guys, you can bet your sweet ass they intercepted this letter too. And they realized, oh, is that so? He's going to launch a major offensive against us, is he? We got to take him down. And take him down, they did. As Patton later began linking communism with Judaism, his fate was finally sealed. Interestingly, Patton had always carried with him a special notebook. It disappeared from his pocket upon his arrival at the hospital after the accidental collisions, right? Patton once said, I have a little black book in my pocket, and when I get back home, I'm going to blow the hell out of everything. Oh, to have that book now. Oh, you can just imagine what must have been in that. But Jewelry made sure that Patton would never see America again and would never release the contents of that little notebook of his. Would I ever love to know, though, what was in that book, wouldn't you? In his book, Target Patton, author Robert Wilcox described his interviews with World War II sharpshooter Douglas Bazata, who was a Lebanese Jew who managed later on in life to develop a conscience and come clean with what he had known about what went on in the World War II era. He wound up dying in 1999, but several years prior to this, he started opening his mouth. Based on these interviews, details emerged of how Bazata had staged the car crash that killed Patton by getting a troop truck to plow into Patton's Cadillac. He admitted that he was told to do this. He then arranged for the general to be shot with a low-velocity projectile which entered Patton's neck while his fellow passengers had escaped without a scratch. The impact theory is less likely since the vehicles were advancing at only 20 miles per hour, both being hardly damaged at all, right? So it looks like those things weren't necessarily staged to kill him. It was staged so that in the fracas of it all, they could inject him with what wound up putting the bubble in his bloodstream, right? Bazata said that the order to silence Patton was given by the head of the OSS, General Wild Bill Donovan, the predecessor to the CIA, right? Wild Bill Donovan, who was pursuing close ties with communist intelligence officers. Donovan told Bazata, quote, we've got a terrible situation with this great patriot. He's out of control, and we must save him from himself and from turning everything the Allies have done, ruining everything that the Allies have done. We got to prevent him from ruining what the Allies have done. Can you imagine? Oh, yeah, Wild Boy Bill Donovan was one hell of an evil little Zio frickin' ass-licking bastard, folks. This same Lebanese Jewish marksman gave similar testimony to a group of 450 ex-members of the OSS at the Hilton Hotel in Washington on September 25th, 1979. Bazata stated, quote, many high-ranking military persons hated Patton. I know who killed him because I was hired to set up the accident by General William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, for $10,000, he said. But since Patton didn't die in the accident, well, so I guess maybe they did intend to do it, but in the fracas, they had this backup plan. We'll inject him, in the fracas so he won't know what's happening. He was kept in isolation in the hospital, he said, where he was killed with an injection. Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought it was done during the fracas. No, it was actually done in the hospital. I misunderstood something he said prior to this. Anyways. So, yeah, apparently they did intend to kill him in the accident. It didn't work. So he was kept in isolation, he said, so that he could be easily injected with a bubble. Bang. So there you go, guys. That's it. So here, it was a Jew who had a conscience, right? He actually told the whole story. There's no question. I mean, we didn't need that confession to put this together, right? But now, armed with that and all this other evidence, it's a done deal. They murdered this true patriot, this true human being. General Bill Donovan is alleged to have been a crypto Jew, by the way, since his mother, Anna Letitia Donovan, was likely a Jewess. Her name, Anna Letitia, is typically Jewish, but uncommon as an Irish name. Donovan's rise as a Wall Street lawyer, his intimacy with FDR's Jewish inner circle, and his role as adjunct to Jewish Judge Samuel Roseman at the Nuremberg trials strengthens the premise of Donovan's Jewish identity, or at least his Jewish sympathies, right? His Jewish ass-licking. And those sympathies felled a great American hero through the intrigues of the dark forces of international Jewry, now absolutely pervasive in our modern world. So there you go, guys. In a nutshell, that's the story of General Patton. So very important to include in this series on what was done to Germany. He personally was trying desperately to stop what was being done to the German people. He recognized that it was a Semitic/Jewish war against the German people. He tried to stop it. He tried to take down the Jewish Bolsheviks, right? The USSR, the Jewish communist-run USSR. And because of that, they took him out. There you have it, folks. Just yet another ugly, disgusting Jewish crime that still has gone without justice being served, right? Oh, that pile of unserved justice crimes is piled higher than the heavens, isn't it? You only hope there is such a thing one day as a judgment day in the hereafter. Because let me tell you, there's a lot of scumbags who deserve a lot of justice. But in the meantime, justice needs to be served here, doesn't it? These bastards need to be put in their place. All right, guys, thanks for joining me. Lots more to come. We'll catch you in the next video. Take care.